Hey, See You Now listeners, it's Shauna Butler. As nurses around the world are marking International Nurses Day with the 2023 theme of Our Nurses, Our Future, we're returning to the episode we aired on International Nurses Day in 2022 for an urgent reminder of what nurses around the world are experiencing and expressing. We do so as their message resonates with even greater strength and awareness that our nurses and our future depend heavily on massive and immediate investments to better protect, support, advance, and care for the nurses who care for us. Enjoy the show.
See You Now is a podcast highlighting the innovative and human-centered solutions that nurses are coming up with to solve for today's most challenging healthcare problems. Created in collaboration with Johnson & Johnson and the American Nurses Association, and hosted by nurse economist and health tech specialist, Shauna Butler.
Welcome to See You Now. I'm Shauna Butler, joined for this episode by Linda Benton, Senior Director, Global Community Impact Strategic Initiatives for Johnson & Johnson Nursing.
Hi, Shauna. I am so excited to be here with you today to mark the importance of May 12th, also known as International Nurses Day, the birth anniversary of statistician, social activist, and nurse Florence Nightingale, who is celebrated for her pioneering role in modern nursing and health system innovation.
During May, National Nurses Month, we'll feature stories that cover many facets of nursing expertise, talent, inventiveness, and the actions that leaders, organizations, and society can take to support, protect, and invest in nurses in ways that ultimately protect the public and our health systems.
And in honor of International Nurses Day, it's a great time to turn our attention to nurses across the globe.
Overall, we are seeing a reduction in the nursing workforce when we actually need it most.
This was playing out across the globe.
The extent of that scale was very surprising to me personally.
As part of our Meeting of Minds series, we listen in as 4 McKinsey partners from their healthcare systems and services practice reveal the results of a McKinsey Company survey of frontline nurses across 6 countries, including Brazil, France, Japan, Singapore, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
In this survey that Shauna is referring to, between 20 and 30% of surveyed nurses indicated they were likely to leave their current direct patient care role in the next year.
That's profoundly worrying. Each of these countries and cultures has dramatically different care delivery networks, financial models, workforce regulations, health systems, and policies, and still, there are more similarities than differences in overall nursing sentiment when it comes to wanting to move on or away from nursing.
Nurses around the world are thinking about how to do things in a different way and not being wedded to the status quo.
We know the nursing profession has faced foundational challenges for decades, and COVID has certainly exacerbated these difficulties. Yet in most countries, up to half of the respondents said their decision to leave was not directly related to the pandemic.
This could be the catalyst to finally getting the attention of the many underlying challenges that nurses have faced for a number of years, pre-COVID.
With the risks of widespread nursing vacancies, shortages, and loss of expertise, understanding why nurses want to leave and are leaving, and learning and sharing how to better protect, support, advance, and care for our teams that care for us is imperative.
And while these findings are certainly not surprising, it should be a wake-up call for all of us to come together across borders to respond.
Nurses are crying out to be empowered to be able to do more.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gretchen Berlin, a senior partner with McKinsey. I am a nurse by training and have been leading our research into the sentiment of nurses over the last few years. And while we recognize there have been challenges and pressures in the nursing workforce long before the pandemic, we actually started surveying nurses here in the US last year. And for Nurses Week, published some research that was pretty startling at the time, showing that about 20% of nurses said that they intended to leave within the next year. And given what we had all seen and experienced at different levels throughout the pandemic to date, that wasn't necessarily surprising, but it was pretty alarming. Over the intervening months, and it now has been a year, we've seen that actually tick up. So when we updated the survey in the fall, we saw that number increase to 30% of nurses indicating their intention to leave. And that number has held steady at that elevated rate of about 1 in 3 nurses. What we have also seen, though, is increase in turnover, at least in the US. So some of this playing out in our clinical workforce. And we started to hear anecdotally that this was playing out really across the globe. And for this year's Nurses Week, sought out to understand analytically what that looked like. So we launched a survey, certainly not in every country, but in some countries to represent regions across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, and saw pretty consistent trends. On average, about 20 to 30% of nurses saying that they intended to leave. There was some notable outliers, but when you look at an international scale, the churn that we'll see is potentially untenable. We have issued a separate report projecting that we may actually be short 10 to 20% of the nursing professionals that we need based on the demand that we see. The demand is not going away. We have patients, at least in the US, who are getting older, who are getting more chronically ill. We have pent-up demand from COVID. So all of this is going to increase demand, and then the actual number of nursing professionals to meet that is unlikely to be enough. I would note we're talking about nurses here today, but it's not just nurses. We're actually seeing it on clinical workforce across the board. We have seen reports of physician likelihood to leave. We have certainly seen turnover in nursing assistants, ultrasound techs, lab technicians, pharmacy, you name it. And the current crisis that exists may get worse before it gets better. So with me today to bring that global perspective are 3 of my colleagues.
Hello, I'm Thomas London from Paris. I lead McKinsey's healthcare practice in France, and I co-lead our provider practice in Europe, serving health systems and healthcare providers across the region.
Hi, my name is Robin Rourke. I'm a partner with McKinsey Company in our healthcare practice and also a physician by training. I lead McKinsey's Latin American healthcare practice and work with many of the leading systems in the region.
My name is Senthu Armugam. I'm based in Kuala Lumpur, and I'm a partner in our healthcare practice, serving clients across Asia, from providers to health systems, working on topics spanning strategy and operations.
First of all, thank you for joining and raising awareness of this issue globally. But would love just your reactions to when you got the results for your region. Was it what you were expecting? Were you surprised to see how consistently of an issue this really is? I'll start with Thomas London, who is here representing Europe. And specifically, we were able to share survey results this year from France and the UK.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Indeed, I think the survey, when we ran it in France and in Europe for the first time this year, was, I would argue, no big surprise. However, it did confirm a number of hypotheses that we were thinking about when looking at the crisis. Maybe a few words of what we are observing in France these days and the issues you've just mentioned, Gretchen, in the US. We see very similar things. We've seen issues retaining nurses and a number of departures. We've also seen exploding levels of absenteeism, where historically it was around 10%, and we're seeing 15 to 20% in some places. And then finally, difficulties in hiring. Up to 5 or 10% of the jobs remain vacant. So overall, we are seeing a reduction in the nursing workforce when we actually need it most.
Thank you. And Senthu, welcome. I know we have results for Asia, for Singapore, as well as for Japan, and would love your reactions to those specifically, as well as across the region.
Thanks, Gretchen. It's great to be here. I'm Senthu Armugam. I'm a partner from our Kuala Lumpur office, part of the healthcare practice here in Asia. I think to your question, Gretchen, it was mixed. There were certain aspects that came out of the survey that were not surprising at all, namely the challenges that nurses were facing: fatigue, burnout, abuse, the lack of flexibility from a lifestyle and working hours point of view. These were challenges that nurses have been wrestling with for some time. And so that wasn't a surprise. I think what surprised me was the impact this has had on retention of nurses and how nurses are thinking about their careers going forward. Specifically, the fact that so many more nurses now are thinking about leaving clinical care. And that's a huge challenge. I mean, just to put some numbers to it, in Asia, or at least in Singapore to start, roughly a third of nurses that were surveyed had indicated that they were likely to leave their current position in providing direct care. Japan was a very similar story, 28%. That's a fifth of the nursing workforce in the country. It's huge. The extent of that scale was very surprising to me personally.
Do you have any sense why?
Just some hypotheses, Gretchen. I think some of the clinical protocols that were put in place in Singapore and Japan during the pandemic may have resulted in more intense working conditions, particularly for nurses. And also, it seems like abuse was prevalent in these markets, at least from what we see at a high level in public research has been done. We need to recognize that there is an increasingly intense set of working conditions that our nurses are facing across markets, and Asia is no exception to that. And what I mean by that specifically, working hours as a function of COVID have become significantly more challenging than pre-pandemic. The hostility that certain nurses are facing from patients who are now facing incredibly intense and pressurized situations has increased dramatically. We think about the emotional challenges that nurses are faced with over the past 2 years, especially in the first 12 months of the pandemic. We're talking about really harsh and difficult psychological conditions of seeing patients really suffering. We need to take all that into account as we reflect on the conditions that they face day to day.
That's where the US was last year. It has grown from there. And last, but certainly not least, we have Robin Rourke representing Latin America, and specifically we have survey results as it relates to Brazil. So Robin, would love for you to introduce yourself and share your reactions.
Thank you, Gretchen, and great to be with everybody here today. My name is Robin Rourke. I'm a partner in our healthcare practice. I lead our Latin American healthcare practice. I'm a physician by training, and I'm thankful that we're having this discussion. I think it's such a critical issue that we should all be thinking about how to solve. You know, I think when you look at Brazil, there actually were some pretty interesting and surprising findings, especially when you look at Brazil compared to some of the other countries. The likelihood to leave nursing for the respondents that were surveyed was actually the lowest across all of the countries surveyed. And just to give you a sense, it was 10% in Brazil compared to mid-20s to even mid-30s in a lot of the other countries. And you have to step back and say, what's driving that? There are a number of factors, and certainly it warrants more investigation and more study. But when you look at a bit more granular level, there are a few things taking place that should be illustrative of themes that might help us to address this dire situation. The first is that there's a big difference in the way that longer tenured nurses are thinking about their role both in the pandemic, managing patient care, and then looking forward being a nurse for a longer term career. It's about a 3-to-1 difference. So nurses that have been in nursing for 5 or more years had a likelihood to leave of around 10%. Nurses that are less than 5 years, upwards of 30+% in terms of likelihood to leave in Brazil. So what does that tell you? It tells you that retention strategies for newer nurses are absolutely critical, along with many of the things that we know are important for nursing satisfaction, continued education, the opportunity to advance, and flexibility in work. There's also an interesting finding in Brazil, which is that the nurses rated their experience to be more meaningful and more engaging relative to any other country that we surveyed. And so it's tough to know exactly what's driving that. But I think when you start to dig into it a little bit, what we see is that the nurses that are spending time in the lower acuity setting of care that provides some reprieve from the day-to-day stresses of managing individuals with COVID, for the nurses that are actually working in homes and home health care, where they probably are creating a more personal experience with the patients and the families, those nurses obviously had a much higher satisfaction and much lower likelihood to leave. Those are a lot of the nursing specific factors, but I do have to step back and say there are other macroeconomic and social factors that I think are probably influencing the results. Things like the unemployment rates. When you look at the unemployment rates across each of these different countries, they probably do have an influence on the way that people are thinking about their job in nursing versus other opportunities.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Your point on the economy is spot on, because nursing, and I think several of the frontline healthcare professions, have been counter-cyclical for decades, meaning when the economy is doing better, we see folks exiting, and when the economy declines, we see folks back. So you're spot on. The macroeconomic environment probably dictates some of this that we see internationally. We have found the topic of compensation in the drivers of whether you stay or leave interesting to watch as well, because it has always been a part of the top driver, but it has never been the number one driver as we've looked in the US. And it's been part and parcel with culture. And we ask the question, is adequate compensation? I think it's fair to say that adequate probably means competitive to options out there in other nursing, non-clinical nursing roles or non-healthcare roles entirely. Some of our colleagues who have looked at attrition across industries are just seeing similar phenomenons where if you can work at a computer, you have now all of a sudden the national or global job market in front of you. I think there's some hypothesis that the whole in-person labor force is going to become gigatized across the board, and we'll see. I'm not sure nurses will find the meaning in doing some of the roles that are on offer, but there is definitely increased competition in compensation. I don't think you can pay people enough if you don't support the environment that they're in and support their careers and support their mental health. But some of the factors we saw in the survey were actually, I thought, pretty shockingly consistent when we asked what would influence your decision to stay or leave. Just the consistency with which folks cited doing meaningful work, having positive interactions with teams, feeling that you had caring and trusted teammates. It's so interesting how consistently culture just plays a role in that. Was it there before COVID? Because we also see variance in the impact of COVID on likelihood of leaving. So I think our low points were Brazil and Japan, where only 20% of nurses said COVID was the impact, versus the high point in France and the US, up to about 40%. But that means, sure, the pandemic was a part of it, but actually anywhere from 60 to 80% was influenced by other factors. And just curious if anyone has reflections on that. Go ahead, Thomas.
Thanks, Rich. And if I may offer a perspective again from Europe, my sense is that a lot of the things that we're seeing now were there before. They've simply been exacerbated by COVID. And I think there is one element around the conditions of work, the working environment, which is absolutely crucial. And obviously having to work under a lot of stress, constraint, pressure has not improved things. There is a second element that I found very interesting and surprisingly high in the survey is how much the expectations for personal development and growth is critical. And I think that's been long a frustration of nursing staff in France is, what are the opportunities that I have as an individual to grow and develop as a person versus being treated as a resource?
Thomas, I'd say that's a very consistent theme to what we see here in Asia. I can say from experiences looking at the nursing profession in Malaysia, as well as Singapore, nurses are crying out to be empowered to be able to do more. And we don't have in these markets the concept of a nurse practitioner. And there's a real demand to say, can we do more at the top of our license? Can we raise that ceiling? And as nurses be enabled and empowered to do more? And I think, frankly, the interesting thing is it's in the interest of the overall healthcare system to do that. Because if you think about we're constrained to the number of physicians, we need more providers focused on primary care. And there's no reason why we can't turn to nurses to be able to deliver a lot of that care and close some of those care gaps.
Yeah. Go ahead, Robin.
Well, I sent through Thomas, I think, seeing the same thing very much in Latin America, where, the ability to evaluate and then optimize the care delivery model, practicing at the top of license, if you will, opportunity is absolutely huge. And Gretchen, I think that you've hit on a great point. I think if you look at the reason why maybe in many cases we're not paying nurses competitively, globally, that probably means different things. One of the reasons is I think as a healthcare system, we've kind of over-indexed on the role of meaningful work. To be an excellent healthcare professional, you have to find meaning in the work. You've got to care about treating patients. You've got to care about helping families. You've got to care about the highest level of quality. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean in today's economy that you need to pay less for that. And in fact, these are highly talented, highly skilled individuals that have other options. And so I think we need to reevaluate how we balance compensation with meaning in work, right? And certainly there's a role for both. I mean, these are individuals that are being affected by a changing care landscape and very rapidly changing acuity of care. What can you do to support the individual from a flexibility perspective? Thomas, you mentioned training and education, recognition. Those things are so critical as we look at the nursing workforce. And I guess, Gretchen, to respond to your question, and I'd love to get the group's thoughts on this, the other thing that I think is absolutely remarkable is the impact of the pandemic of COVID-19 on the likelihood to leave and the variability that we're seeing across many of the different countries that we surveyed. When you look at Brazil and Japan, for example, being in the mid-20s, 23% increase on the impact of leaving versus some of these other countries like the US at 40%, France at 43%. What's driving that variability? I've got my hypotheses, but would love your thoughts as well, because it's obviously a big part of the trend we're seeing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you guys talked about the career journey and professionalization of nursing that I know, at least in the US and North America, we've been on a journey for the last several decades. If you're part of the ecosystem, I think the survey continues to be a call to action to focus on that. And I deliberately say ecosystem because I think health systems are doing a lot of it. I think education providers are evolving training in terms of management skills and research skills beyond just clinical care to support nurses on that journey. It really takes the full system, society as well, in terms of what we expect of nurses and how we reward nurses and revere the profession to help advance this. And I think it's a call to action to go back to those fundamentals around supporting and retaining. I personally have been in many conversations. Obviously, a lot of folks are focused on how do we expand the pipeline, how do we recruit, but I want to make sure that everyone focuses too on stopping the bleed, right? Like, how do we make sure that we retain the ones who are here? And I would just highlight something that strikes me always when we see this is the number of nurses who are really likely to stay. And actually, one of the surprising things when we did this last year was how COVID reinforced that likelihood to stay as they leaned into and were excited by the acuity of patients or the renewed purpose that some of the pandemic was giving to folks. But I'm curious what you guys see as the kind of call to action in here, and whether it's health systems or higher education or governments or society can do to help.
Maybe I step back and describe how the health system itself is changing in Asian markets. And I suspect there are very clear corollaries to North America, South America, and Europe globally. Number one, care is shifting from hospitals to the community, hospitals to the home.
Yeah.
The role of prevention, the role of care management, care coordination, unequivocally is fully supported by the data, the impact it has in outcomes, and the importance it plays. As those shifts are happening, the role of a nurse, nurses are already, in many ways, the backbone of the system, and a system that is largely centered on hospitals. As we shift to the home, as we shift to the community, my perspective is the role of a nurse is going to become increasingly critical. And the skills that required to support patients in navigating the system, support patients in delivery of care in a home setting versus in an acute setting, those skills are the ones that need to be developed and enhanced. And I think nurses are crying out for this as well. They're asking for this. There's a recognition that this is going to happen. I can use Japan as an example, where we saw nurses felt, relative to some of the other markets in Asia, increasingly less prepared. And you could argue in Japan, there's going to be a tidal wave when this shift happens, because the system is so entrenched in an acute context. Average length of stay in Japan is about 16 days. OECD average is 8. And of course, Japan is facing a massive challenge in terms of aging. That's going to massively shift context into a home. And I think nurses recognize that challenge is coming and they feel exposed. So these are the capabilities that we need to really think about supporting our nurses around in terms of development.
Senthu raises a great point, and I'll build on that by saying, as you see a shift in the care delivery model from inpatient to outpatient, from outpatient to home, from new settings of care, digital, obviously, telehealth being a huge one that we're all seeing as the disruptor, I think we do have an opportunity to reevaluate the role of nurses in the healthcare ecosystem as you move to new care modalities, as you move to new digital care delivery mechanisms. in a place like Latin America, what we're seeing is that the health systems are not focused on incremental advancements in care delivery and care delivery capabilities. It's a time for leapfrogging. We're making big jumps because of a number of things that I think right now are huge opportunities for the region. You've got a very rapidly growing digital infrastructure. You've got a number of private investors from Latin America and outside of Latin America that are excited to invest in new care delivery capabilities because there are precedents for this, especially when you look at banking industry, the travel industry, and some other industries that have done this very effectively over the last 5 to 10 years, that in healthcare in Latin America, we have a huge opportunity to make nonlinear, massive advancements in care delivery because of this confluence of an opportunity to change post-pandemic, the opportunity and availability to use digital in new ways, and the receptivity of patients and providers and nurses to do things in a different way, which frankly, I'm not sure we've seen in the healthcare system in years. And so this is the time. And I hope it's true in every region, but this is the time to change. And I think as we do that, the systems that find ways to leverage, Senthu, as you said, the people that are the backbone of the healthcare delivery system, the nurses, this is the time to think about the next role for nurses in this new model.
Yeah, I love that. I think technology, certainly in the care delivery model, we're seeing a lot of health systems harness what they used during COVID for virtual admission intakes, virtual discharges, and then moving it to a more permanent role. I actually think nurses would love to have that as part of their role. So they could rotate through, some days being virtual, some days being in person, to provide the flexibility into an otherwise in-person role so that they can enjoy some of the flexibility that folks are getting embedded in other careers. I personally think that's going to be something that keeps folks in clinical nursing. Otherwise, there's just such a wealth of opportunities elsewhere.
Absolutely. Technology will be a big thing.
I think, Thomas, the question will be who will be the innovators? You've got to have leadership from the health systems, from the governments, from private equity and venture capital and investors more broadly, from the insurance or payer organizations. But it is absolutely critical that you have innovation from front lines, from the nurses that are out there and seeing this, and that the nurses around the world are thinking about how to do things in a different way and not being wedded to the status quo. And I just think that mindset, even in a small group of individuals, can drive such a massive improvement in the overall quality of care, the overall experience for patients and for nurses and for clinicians broadly. And it's really with that top level support for an innovative healthcare economy, but also the grassroots bottom up opportunities for people to identify solutions on the front line.
I agree with you, Robin. I think there's one caution of saying, well, this is on the nurses to say what the problems are and what the solution should be. The last thing they have is more hours in the day to do that. But as long as you're operating in an environment that supports you in it, right? So this is where it gets back to what we were talking about, I think, a bit earlier on, of doubling down on the caring environment, the trust in leadership, the shared governance models, and the voice at the table. All of that reinforces your ability to raise innovative ideas, like you're saying, Robin. Otherwise, I think we are seeing nurses innovate. Unfortunately, often they're innovating by leaving clinical care to go start a company for a solution. What strikes me when we look globally of just how consistent this challenge is, what's the thing that you're seeing in your region that you think has potential? Senthu, what's giving you hope that there's going to be clinical workforce when you and your family need it?
There is some silver lining to COVID. And to me, it is actually that I think this could be the catalyst to finally getting the attention of the many underlying challenges that nurses have faced for a number of years, pre-COVID. Hospital administrators, policy leaders, ministries of health, politicians are suddenly now, folks that were not necessarily as aware or as engaged in understanding these issues are suddenly acutely aware of it. And we're beginning to see policy dialogues unfold, for example, in Singapore, around how do we better support our nurses. We're seeing discussions around how do we think about wages in a more appropriate way and supporting our nurses with the appropriate financial compensation. How do we support them with the appropriate training? How do we keep them safe, frankly? These dialogues are beginning to happen in a much more accelerated way, at least in the markets that I've looked at. So that's what I'm hopeful about, that it's just going to kind of start building the momentum, and hopefully these dialogues are going to continue, and we'll start seeing real changes to resolve some of these challenges.
And reflecting on the situation in France in particular, because I think some other European countries like the UK have moved further, I haven't seen the out-of-the-box solution yet. And out-of-the-box would probably be in what we described earlier, in breaking up the boundaries of the different professions. What gets done by a nurse, what gets done by a physician, etc. I think, to me, redefining that and making sure we take all of the opportunities from digital and automation to redefine, in a way, the entire workforce model for the way we deliver care. To me, that's where the solution eventually lays, given the magnitude of the needs and the shortage we're faced with today.
Robin, what would you say for Latin America?
Yeah, I might expand in a little bit beyond Latin America. I was looking up the phrase, necessity is the mother of invention. And the original quote was, our need will be the real creator. There will always be a need for healthcare. That is almost a universal truth. And therefore, I think the healthcare system will find a way to create resiliency. And that will be through all of the people that care deeply about healthcare. That it's, I think, been a timeless truth of the healthcare systems in its many forms over many thousands of years. I think if you look at the adoption of telemedicine in a time when you couldn't go into the physician's office, just that adoption, the healthcare system changed within a matter of weeks. And so I think, Gretchen, what gives me hope is the fact that we've always innovated in healthcare. We've got to keep experience for patients, clinicians, physicians, nurses, everybody that works in the healthcare system. We've got to keep that at the center. We've got to keep quality at the center. And I think at the end of the day, when you find a way to deliver the access to provide all of those things throughout the world, and we're not doing a perfect job today, but hopefully we'll do a better job tomorrow, that's what gives me hope.
I was reminded from a friend of an expression in relation to something else in our personal lives that was, diamonds are made under pressure. And I think it's another take on what you're saying, Robin. Through this crisis, hopefully something beautiful comes out. I do think we should recognize that it's not going to be without real suffering. Obviously, loss of life through COVID aside, but the burdens on clinical workforce and the impact on their own mental health is something that certainly keeps me up at night. And I'm not sure we have yet put in the brakes in the system to allow for support. One example we've talked about in the US is how we treat active duty soldiers, and that we have a certain amount of time you can be deployed versus have to be back stateside, the deploy to dwell ratio, or they even have embedded behavioral health professionals for folks who are on the front lines on a daily basis. And do we need a model like that to support our clinical workforce? I'm curious if you guys are seeing anything else to support the mental health of our frontline workforce.
It's mental health, but maybe a broader challenge is abuse in general. Mental abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. As we think about leaders in healthcare, whether they be administrators or policy leaders, there needs to be a zero tolerance acceptance of abuse that nurses face. And I think this is thematic across markets. I recognize that oftentimes this abuse is coming from patients, and patients that are under extreme stress, duress, emotionally and physically. But that doesn't in any way justify or legitimize that challenge. And I think it can be incredibly demotivating when you don't have leadership that does step up in a very bold and direct way to support nurses that are facing abuse. And the sad thing is, speaking with some nurses in the markets that I've worked in, it's almost as though abuse is an accepted part of the job. That's completely unacceptable. And as leaders in healthcare, we need to make sure that's something that we think about.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Thomas?
I think we've seen too little in terms of mental health support. I think this is still, how do we respond? The crisis is still very much something we're grappling with. I think we've started to see some places think about, wellness office and dedicated resources where you can actually find support and support in time of crisis, but also over the longer term. But I think we're still seeing too little of that, unfortunately. But I think more fundamentally, this is also a challenge to the management culture in hospitals. The more we are able to get to models where frontline teams have the means to make as many decisions as they can, operationally, the better we are in the robustness and the resilience of the system and the ability to give meaning to the work on a daily basis. So I think this challenges the way we think about managing hospital activities.
Yeah. And Robin, as you answer, how do you think of this support should be embedded over the arc of a nurse's career? I think one of the things when we talked about kind of turnover at different tenures, and there was the Health Affairs article in the US saying that our workforce decreased for the first time ever, which I think people expected at the retirement level, but it was actually in the younger nurses too. And it's important that we have solutions at all ends.
Yeah, Gretchen, taking a longitudinal view of a nursing career and thinking about what are all of the things that support a nurse's development, satisfaction, ability to lead over time and advance, ability to have a flexible model as you get to different stages of life and may need more or less flexibility. Figuring out how you tailor that model is absolutely critical. The other thing that struck me as I looked at all of our results is that there are real differences in what drives retention by country and by region, and probably at a more granular level by type of health system, nonprofit, for-profit, faith-based, non-faith-based, that you can use to create this nursing development and retention model. And I was just struck when I look across all of the different countries that we surveyed, how there are very few actually consistencies in the factors that were rated highest by nurses. And so I think taking a tailored view on how does Brazil look different than Japan or Singapore, what are the things that make France unique? What are the things that'll actually make a difference for your nurses? And I think that's one of the really powerful things in this report is the ability to actually tailor a program to the things that your nursing workforce that they need.
Can I take us back to this question of attracting to the profession? In today's job, and particularly in those professions, job security is not really an issue. And we see young professionals, much more look for the ability to explore early in their careers, to try out different things, to try out different facets of the job. I'm just wondering to what extent we shouldn't try to think about, as some corporations do for high potentials, where you go through several things for the first 2, 3, 4 years, you explore. Yeah. In that way, from the onset, you start thinking about the personal development.
We've been talking today about recruiting and retaining nurses in many ways because of the fact that that's part of the lexicon and the way that historically the nursing workforce has been talked about. What if you were to change the frame? What if you were to start to think about attracting and cultivating, attracting and enriching and developing, right? And you don't even think about retaining because you create a model that's so attractive that people would do anything to be in that profession. You think about the way to create such prestige in the provision of care to other people that you don't even need to think about retainment because it's a profession that so many people want to go into. It may be a way that as an industry, we need to change the frame a bit of how we think about people development.
I fully agree, Robin, with that point you're making, and Thomas, what you're saying. There's one nuance that I think I would introduce. I don't have a good answer to this, but it's just a nuance to consider as folks debate this question, which is, what are the drivers for folks to become nurses? As you look outside of North America, particularly in Asia, international workers are a huge component of the nursing workforce. In Singapore, a third of our nurses are not Singaporean. They're from the Philippines, they're from India, they're from markets that are historically known to send nurses out across the world. And they have a very different motivation and a very different set of motivations as to why they're becoming nurses. And I think as we think about the question you're raising, Robin, I hope leaders understand what those drivers are and then cater to those different needs and the different paths that then kind of unfold from there.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right, Pinto. And that's why I really think that this is a societal, large systems issue. because we're hearing anecdotally some decrease in interest in applications to nursing schools for the first time really ever in the US, whether it's fear, concern, just other options out there. And we're going to need the next generation. And so how do we make this, to Robin, your point, a place where you can really thrive, in a profession that you can be your fullest self? But I really think there's a place for all parts of society, private sector, to be supporting those entering this profession. The way, and I know this varies across the globe, but the way that we do support our military servicemen and women, there's all kinds of systemic support and camaraderie around them in a way that I think we need to start thinking about our healthcare professionals in that regard also. Back to what gives me hope is to continue global conversations on this scale. I worked in the UK briefly, and I think there's often quick reactions to point out differences that we have globally and why solutions may not work. And there's more opportunity than not, I believe, to take some of the technological advances you were referencing, Robin, in Latin America, and port them globally, and some of the support you were saying, Senthu, in Asia, and really taking this moment and porting those across. So I want to say thank you to you all for joining the conversation, and certainly challenge us to continue to bring light to this issue and bring solutions rapidly as we see them, because admiring the problem is certainly not enough, and we want to move well beyond that.
Thanks to the team from McKinsey Company coming from all corners of the world, including nurse and senior partner Gretchen Berlin in Washington, D.C., partner Thomas London, who's actually in Paris, physician and partner Robin Rourke, who leads the Latin American healthcare practice, and Senthu Armugam, part of McKinsey's healthcare practice across Asia. And special thanks to Anna Dirksen for assistance in organizing this conversation.
As we think about International Nurses Day, one saying keeps coming up for me, and that's think globally, but act locally. This survey points to the global magnitude of a problem that affects all of us every day on a very real and very personal level. And it could mean going without care. Nurses perform some of the most critical tasks across the healthcare sector. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw nurses across the world step in and lead at new levels and in new roles, delivering meaningful impact in patient care and outcomes in numerous ways. In this survey, more than 70% of direct patient care nurses across 6 different countries said doing meaningful work was a top reason why they stay in their jobs. But that same survey also highlighted potential challenges, with 28 to 38% of nurses surveyed in 5 of the 6 countries saying they were likely to leave their current direct patient care role within the year. A striking degree of consistency across countries, despite different healthcare systems and delivery networks in each of the countries. While the reasons for leaving vary, one thing is becoming abundantly clear. If nurses continue to express a desire to leave direct patient care at these elevated rates, healthcare may be at risk.
Coming up with ways to attract, support, protect, advance, and elevate nurses must be a top priority for all healthcare systems. As Robin suggests, we talk about recruiting and retaining nurses because that's part of the lexicon. Historically, that's how the nursing workforce has been talked about. But what if you were to change the frame? What if we think about attracting and cultivating and enriching and developing, and retaining talent is no longer an issue because we've created a career experience that's so attractive that people would do anything to be in that profession? You think about creating such prestige in the provision of care to other people that you don't even need to think about retainment. We need to change the frame of how we think about people development. For See You Now, I'm Shauna Butler.
I'm Linda Benton.
Be certain to take action in protecting and investing in the nurses in your corner of the world.
And thanks for listening.
Nurses are transforming healthcare through innovation, compassion, and leadership. And Johnson & Johnson is proud to continue its 125-year commitment to champion nurses through recognition, skill building, leadership development, and more. The American Nurses Association is dedicated to building a culture of innovation. Nurses improve the lives of patients and communities through innovative thinking, empathetic connection, scientific rigor, and sheer determination. ANA is proud to support and advocate for our nation's most valuable healthcare resource, our nurses. For more information on See You Now and to listen to any of the earlier episodes in our library, visit seeyounowpodcast.com.